In today's video, we'll touch on anti-Semitism. Is it really just something that we see in the West and Middle East? And what does the Bible say about this? Anti-Semitism is having a certain perception of the Jewish people, which is often expressed through hatred, hostility, prejudice, and discrimination against them. So the Holocaust in the early 1940s gives us a painful recount of how anti-Semitism played out. Tragically, many believers played a part in the killing of the Jewish people. Michael Brown actually wrote a book that touched more on anti-Semitism. It's entitled "Our Hands Are Stained with Blood." So the challenge that the Gentile body of Christ faces today is passive indifference towards Israel. We think that we are in agreement with God when we find our hearts in that place of, yeah, I don't feel much for Israel and I don't hate her, so I think I'm okay. So we often look at anti-Semitism as something that's rampant only in the West and in the Middle East. However, Romans 11 makes it clear and warns us that there is a progression towards anti-Semitism, and the only safe place against it is at the place of cultivating understanding that will give rise to worship and reckless abandonment towards the Lord. And we can only agree with God and partner with Him if we understand His heart. So what does the Bible say about this? We have to look at Romans 11, and specifically Romans 11 verse 20 to 25 that reveal how our personal faith will be put in jeopardy if we do not have understanding of the dynamics that would play out regarding Israel in our lifetime. So Romans 11:25 says, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." And even in verse 20, Paul actually warned, "Do not be haughty, but fear. Do not be arrogant." So God is warning His people not to forget and learn even from what had happened in the 1940s, because ignorance and passive resistance were the downfall of the church even in that time. So with tremendous burden, Paul in Romans 11 verse 25 warns us of the progression of ignorance to arrogance and eventually apostasy, as verse 22 says, being cut off. So ignorance or a lack of understanding can lead to arrogance, and arrogance points to having a presumed superiority over the Jewish people, and this will cause us to boast against Israel, and when we do that, it's actually equivalent to boasting against God, and that's the last thing that we want to find ourselves doing. Ignorance leads to arrogance, and arrogance leads to passive resistance of a subtle dishonoring of the Jewish people, where one can find themselves being cynical or impatient towards the Jewish people. Passive resistance then leads to active resistance, where we may end up even helping the enemies of Israel, and we ourselves becoming the enemies of Israel and the enemies of God Himself. Finally, active resistance leads to apostasy, and in this case, anti-Semitism. Of course, not everyone's ignorance leads to arrogance. However, even in the generation of Jesus' return, we are going to see an increase of pressure and opposition, because it won't be popular to stand with Israel or to speak up for her. And ignorance can actually cause us to be vulnerable to deception, leading to a response that could be very contrary to God's heart. So there is a greater urgency for this generation to not be ignorant, to not be neutral about it, because God is not neutral when it comes to Israel. But we want to pursue a heart that understands and will also have that same zeal for Israel in the same way that God feels for her. We need to be equipped with revelation to stand firm with God and for Israel in a time of the Sum 2 crisis, of that worldwide opposition and unprecedented anti-Semitism. So contrary to the progression of ignorance, what we want is that biblical progression of revelation unto that worship and reckless abandonment to God. So the more we grow in understanding and revelation of God's heart concerning Israel, the more we will pray for her destiny and we will bless her. This enables us to actually receive more grace and have our capacities enlarged so that we can carry the same love and the same zeal towards the Jewish people in the same way that Jesus does. Having said that, standing with Israel doesn't mean that We have to embrace their Jewish customs, celebrate all their feasts, or even turn a blind eye to a sin and rebellion. But standing with Israel means that we agree with God's covenant, with God's sovereign election, and His destiny for her. And we love her the same way that Jesus does. So to conclude, there are 3 litmus tests that we can use to see where we are in terms of our understanding the mystery of Israel. First is that we devote time to pray for her. This is in Romans 9 verse 2-3 and Romans 10 verse 1, the exhortation to pray for the salvation of Israel. Secondly, we will also be finding ourselves awestruck by God, and this is in Romans 11 verse 33-36. Where more than hate knowledge, what we want is really the awe in our hearts and our spirit towards God. We don't want to get sentimental towards Israel, but it's about being awestruck and responding in that worship unto the Lord. Thirdly, we will also find ourselves living with reckless abandonment, so that Romans 11 verse 33-36 response of worship should produce in us a steady and reckless abandonment to God, where we can respond in presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice that will be holy and acceptable to God, where we find ourselves with greater abandonment to the cause of Israel, because it is the very desire of God's heart. So may we not be a people of ignorant arrogance, but that we would be a people of anointed action.